everybody. Welcome back to English 112 for, believe it or not, our last class. And this is for the 11th of May, Thursday, where we are finishing up our poetry section. So last class, unfortunately, I was having some video difficulties, though I did post a video from the previous class. And we were talking about the poem America. And if you look at the notes below, not only do I have a link for Ginsberg's live reading of America, which if you haven't already listened to, please do so. But I also have a link for Ginsberg reading that poem again without a live audience. It's a very different kind of tone. The live audience link is his draft of the poem, so there are differences between what he read and what the final poem appeared as. And also he read it with a certain level of sarcasm and humor, and the audience responded in turn. When you listen to his second reading, where he's doing it without an audience, he's doing it in a studio, you can see that, first of all, we've got the poem that ultimately was published, and also he reads it in a much more somber and serious way. And that goes to show the differences involved with tone in terms of reading poetry out loud, that in fact reading poetry is very much like acting. When we talked about the drama unit, that much of it depends on interpretation. So that said, one of the things that I wanted to draw your attention to is the section on upcoming assignments, where paper number 2 would have been due on the 9th on Tuesday. So thank you for those of you who submitted in that paper. And journal number 3 poems due, would be due on the 11th, which is today if you're watching this video on Thursday at 11:59 p.m. Both of those would be due via PDF to my email, which is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu. For journal number 3, I'm asking that you select 3 poems from the poetry section and you respond informally to each of those poems, approximately a page or so, and I evaluate informally on a checkmark system. And that's it. The final exam, which is scheduled for the 17th, which is Wednesday, is open book, open notes, and it will mostly be devoted to poetry. What I will do is I will select a handful of poems from the poetry section, ask you to select 2, and to respond to each of those poems in depth. And ultimately, if we had another several weeks to the semester, you could have written a paper number 3 on poetry, but we don't have another several weeks of the semester, so instead you would be running a final exam. And because it's open book, open notes, you can reference things such as your class notes and also your journals. So my goal is to have the journals that you submit back to you by the time you take the examination, which is the 17th. And then you could use those to assist you if it turns out that one of the poems on the final exam, it matches one of the poems that you wrote about. Of course, the idea is that you do as much as you can in the time that you've got, so you would expand and develop. But I don't expect anything as neat or as polished as what you would do with a paper, because if you were taking this class in person, you would have 2 hours to take this examination. Since you're not taking this class in person, you have 24 hours to submit in this exam, but I expect that you would spend approximately 2 hours on the exam. And the exam, if we were meeting in person, would be on the 17th, Wednesday at 3:30 p.m. So that's when I'm going to be posting our final. And then you have 24 hours to submit that, so that a day later, 3:30 p.m. on the 18th on Thursday, is when you should submit in your final, again via PDF, to my email. Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu. And 80 points of the final examination will be based on poetry. So 40 points for each of the 2 poems that you select. And that leaves a 10-point question for short story and a 10-point question for drama, Actually, I'll give you a couple of questions for short story and drama and give you some choice within them. So those would be shorter responses. And that's a way that you could basically address the semester as a whole, though the focus is on poetry. And for Allen Ginsberg and his poem America, I had indicated that this is not included in our textbook, so I provided a link that you could access the poem, or where you could access the poem. And this beat poetry, this stream of consciousness poetry that's supposed to try to mimic thought patterns. So it doesn't necessarily have a sense of structure in the way that most writing has. I think it is very indicative in this poem by Allen Ginsberg, which I think sometimes is nonsensical because the subject is itself nonsensical, America. So if the poem is ugly and raw and again uncomprehensible or incomprehensible, the idea is that so is America. Some people love Allen Ginsberg's poetry because there's a sense of rawness and truth and reality to it. Some people hate Allen Ginsberg's poetry because it's too chaotic and it's mostly a complaint rather than a solution. So I just wanted to draw your attention to a few of the lines, beginning by Ginsberg seeming to have a kind of argument with America, saying, America, I've given you all and now I'm nothing. You know, this idea of how much have I sacrificed for my country and how much has my country given me back in return. And then the second line, America, $2.27, January 17, 1956. Well, the date is in which the poem was written, but the $2.27 could refer to many things. It could be how much money he has in his bank account. It could be how much money he's got in his pocket. It could be how much America thinks he's worth. It could be how much he thinks America is worth. So lots of possibilities here. Lots of references to sanity and insanity, such as I can't stay in my own mind. And Ginsberg himself was known for being in and out of mental institutions. But the thing is, the question in this poem is who or what is insane? Is it the country America? Is it the citizens of America? Is it the author of this poem, or all of the above? Of course, we've got profanity. Go fuck yourself with your atom bomb. A bomb, of course, being phallic. And this idea of I don't feel good, don't bother me, against sanity and insanity. I won't write my poem till I'm in my right mind. But of course, he is writing his poem, which suggests he's in his right mind. When will America be angelic and take off its clothes, live up to the ideals it basically proposes, and show the truth when you take off your clothes? When will you look at yourself through the grave? When will you address all of the pain and death that you're responsible for? Lots of references to communism, lots of references to Russia. The idea is that they were the evil empire and they were going to take over American democracy and American capitalism. Also, lots of references to China for the same idea. It does strike me how contemporary this is in some respects because we're dealing with many of the same tensions with Russia and China. When will you send your eggs to India, America? This idea of when will you share your resources with those who are needier? When can I go into the supermarket and buy what I need with my good looks? And, you know, this idea of the superficiality of our world. This was even long before social media. Your machinery is too much for me. Lots of references to the mechanization of society. If I were going to update this for our contemporary times, I'd say something like, your technology is too much for me. There must be some other way to settle this argument. So again, there's an argument back and forth. Ginsberg is challenging the reader, challenging America, prove me wrong. And asking questions like, are you being sinister, or is this some form of practical joke? And then I'm trying to come to the point, but of course this poem is quite rambling. And when he makes references, lots of topical references to names and events, they're very contemporary for the time. It almost reminds me of a late night monologue that is very timely for that particular week. They become dated rather quickly, but the references he's making are basically to people that he believes have suffered injustices in the world. He also makes lots of references to the idea of the media manipulating people. I haven't read the newspaper for months. Every day somebody goes on trial for murder. Again, if I was going to update this, I might say something to the effect of I haven't looked at social media for months, or because every day somebody, dies from a mass shooting. Um, and he talks about labor unions. He talks about smoking marijuana. Keep in mind that marijuana would have been illegal at that time. So he's talking about a lot of taboo subjects and embracing those taboo subjects. He talks about getting drunk, never getting laid, whorehouses. You should have seen me reading Marx. That would be Karl Marx and communism. My psychoanalyst thinks I'm right. So the irony there is that his therapist thinks he's quite sane. And of course, what does it mean if you need to see a therapist? Does it mean that you have mental issues, or does it mean that you're saner than everyone else? I won't say the Lord's Prayer. So he's openly defiant against things like organized religion. When he says he has mystical visions and cosmic vibrations, he means it. This is drug use. And I'm addressing you. So the idea is that we are America too. Are you going to let your emotional life be run by Time magazine? If I were going to update it, I might change Time magazine to something like TikTok. And he talks about how he's obsessed with it, and it's always telling him about responsibility. And businessmen are responsible, and movie producers are serious and responsible, but he's not. And of course, you have to wonder who is truly responsible and serious. Businessmen and movie producers are known for generating profit, perhaps at the expense of many other individuals. And it occurs to me that I am America. So when he says this, he accepts a certain level of responsibility, culpability. And then he says, I'm talking to myself again. Is anybody listening to me? And when he says, I haven't told you what you did to Uncle Max after he came over from Russia, I can't help but think of somebody like Krebs from Soldiers Home after he came back from Germany, about how our soldiers are battered and bruised, not just in war, but after war. This idea of Asia's rising against me, I haven't got a Chinaman's chance. National resources consist of, and you can see that the poem falls apart at this point. It turns into prose, into a paragraph. Run-on sentences, again, very stream of consciousness. 2 joints of marijuana, millions of genitals, unpublished private literature, and so forth. And I say nothing about my prisons or the millions of underprivileged who live in my flower pots under the light of 500 suns. And I've always thought that was a reference to growing marijuana, growing weed, of the underprivileged who live in flower pots under the light of 500 suns. His ambition is to be president, despite the fact that he's Catholic. Of course, Kennedy and Biden are the only 2 Catholic presidents that we've had. Certainly Biden would not have been applicable during the time of this poem. So he touches on politics. And again, questions things like, how can I write a holy litany in your silly mood? And I'll continue like Henry Ford. Ford was known for the automobile and also for the assembly line, where everything was done uniformly. And there was the sense of the loss of artistry or even humanity in work. Again, if I were to update this, I might talk about something like artificial intelligence. And when he makes references that my strophes are as individual as his automobiles, a strophe is a movement and grief drama from the chorus where everybody says and does the same thing, exactly the same, much like in an assembly line of a factory. And again, he makes lots of references to people who have suffered injustices, Tom Mooney, Spanish loyalists, so forth and so on. And again, the poem collapses into what looks like prose. I was 7. Mama took me a communist cell meeting. They sold us garbanzos, a handful per ticket. A ticket cost a nickel. And he goes on and on and on and comes to the conclusion everybody must have been a spy. That sense of hysteria and paranoia, especially that existed in the 50s with McCarthyism. America, you don't really want to go to war. It's them bad Russians. So the idea is that it's an outside power. It's the alien. It's the other that's responsible for evil, not America. It's them bad Russians and them Chinamen and them Russians. The Russia wants to eat us alive. Notice how he's using English as a second language constructions here. The Russia's power mad. Her wants to grab Chicago. Her wants to take our cars from out of our garages. And at the time, the automobile was seen, especially the two automobile family, as the epitome of wealth and status. Of course, the automobile represents freedom, which is what America represents as well. Her wants our auto plants in Siberia. Him big bureaucracy. That no good. Him make Indians learn read. Him need big black ends, as he actually uses the racial epithet. Her make us work 16 hours a day. Help. The idea that the mechanization of society was merely going to increase, not reduce our workloads, much like what happened with the internet. And then he says, this is quite serious, and this is the impression I get from looking at the TV set. Is this correct? Again, challenging us. Though, of course, we've established that we're America, but then he is as well. I better get right down to the job. I don't want to join the army or turn lathes and precision parts factories. I'm nearsighted and psychopathic anyway. And I'm putting my queer shoulder to the wheel. He meant that quite literally. He was quite open about his sexual orientation. He was homosexual. Again, something that was not discussed during the time period. So when he talks about queer, he means that in all of the senses of the word. So this sense of critique that oftentimes occurs within literature, I've argued, helps to bring about social movements as well as reflect social movements as well. So I wanted to end up with The Lover Not Taken, Coca-Cola and Coco Frio and the Hill We Climb. And The Lover Not Taken, and this is by Farley in 1984, and this is included in our textbook on page 797, though I would have included a link for this as well. Written in 1984, and I think that that's key in terms of understanding this poem. The 80s were known as the decade of greed. It was a time in which there was this assumption that one could have everything if one wanted to badly enough. And I hope that the title, The Lover Not Taken, reminds you of another poem, The Road Not Taken. Because what we have here is a parody. And a parody is just an extreme exaggeration of an original for humor. Sometimes also for satire. And that's what we have with The Lover Not Taken. We had established that The Road Not Taken was about two choices, and we weren't given any specifics about what the choices were, but that one choice precludes another. You can't have it all. This poem, The Lover Not Taken, gives us the specific choice. Notice this is from a female author, as opposed to The Road Not Taken, which is from a male author. And the message is quite different. And I'll read this to you. Committed to one, she wanted both. And mulling it over, long she stood, alone on the road, loath to leave, wanting to hide in the undergrowth. This new guy, smooth as a yellow wood, he really turned her on. She liked his hair, his smile. But the other Jack had a claim on her already. She had to admit, he did wear well. In fact, to be perfectly fair, he understood her. His long, lithe frame beside her in the evening tenderly lay. Still, this blonde guy dropped by some day. Couldn't Way lead on to Way? No, for if Way led on and Jack found out, she doubted if he would ever come back. Oh, she turned with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence, she might be telling this. And I, she would say, stood faithfully by. But by then, who would know the difference? With that in mind, she took the fast way home, the road by the pond, and phoned the blonde. And while you can understand this poem without knowing Frost, the fun of the poem is that you do know the Frost poem and you recognize the similarities with some of the language and the structures of Frost, but you also recognize the differences. And that she's contemplating two lovers, and notice one has a name, Jack, and that means that she has some sort of a emotional connection to him. The other, she just calls him the blonde new guy who's smooth as a yellow wood. So that's the reference to yellow here. He really turned her on, and she liked his hair, his smile. Notice that wood could also be a sexual reference as well as undergrowth when we talk about things like erections. But Jack had a claim on her already, and she had to admit he did wear well, and he understood her. In other words, they have a committed relationship with one another. Beside her in the evening tenderly lay. Still, if the blonde guy dropped by someday, couldn't Way lead on to Way? And no, she's saying that no, she couldn't do that because if Jack found out, he'd probably never come back. And of course, the twist here is that I would have stood faithfully by, but by then who would know the difference? What does it really matter? In the overall scheme of the universe, her particular choice. So with that in mind, she took the fast way home, the phone by the blonde. Notice how much more quickly the poem moves to illustrate how quickly she's moving. And this is a stanza that's only 2 lines long rather than multiple lines long. The road by the pond and phone the blonde. But we're never told what it is that she told the blonde. And we know that the title is The Lover Not Taken. So is she telling the lover no? Would that be the easier choice, just to maintain her relationship with Jack, even though she may not be completely fulfilled? Or would it be perhaps the easy way to have the affair and not to let Jack know? Or the idea that who says she needs to choose one or another? Perhaps she can have both. Unlike the Frost poem that says it should be one or it should be another. So I wanted just to give you an example of a parody and talk a little bit about how artists can oftentimes be inspired by works that have appeared before them, which is why it's nice to know the history and the chronology of artistry, and not just necessarily literature. The same happens with music. I've made many parallels with the idea of song being similar to poetry, and many song lyrics can have the same depth and sophistication that good poetry can as well. There might be a song that you may be familiar with. It's called The Sounds of Silence by Simon and Garfunkel. In fact, if you would look at the notes below, you'll see that I included the video for that song, which also includes the lyrics when they're singing, and I encourage you to watch it. It's about 3 minutes long or so. You'll probably recognize the tune as soon as you hear it. And if you've never really paid attention to the lyrics, really read those lyrics as they're singing, because they really are quite good. This is very much an example of a poem as far as I'm concerned. And in fact, some of the lines are haunting, that the words of the prophets are on the subway walls and tenement halls. Perhaps that's my favorite line. But of course, we've got more contemporary artists that have put their own spin on it. So you'll see that immediately afterwards, you might be familiar with the group Disturbed. They put out a cover of this song. Same words, completely different tone. The Simon and Garfunkel song is more philosophical. It's more reflective. It's more thoughtful. The Disturbed song is more angry, and it's more indignant. And this goes to show how poetry reading or singing a song is influenced by interpretation as much as it can be influenced by the language itself. As we saw with Ginsberg reading his poem America in 2 very different ways, same words, pretty much. Though, of course, the first version I gave you was his draft version. So there were changes made in the final version. But certainly the performance influences our interpretation and the tone. So I wanted you to keep that in mind. And I encourage you to watch the Disturbed performance as well, which I think is equally good. In fact, Simon and Garfunkel said that they were very, very pleased with that cover. And perhaps it suits our more contemporary times, this anger and indignation that Disturbed was able to capture so well with the same lyrics of The Sounds of Silence. So there's a poem called Coca-Cola and Coco Frio by Martina Spada. This was part of the handout. Martina Spada had spoke at GCC, and I am pleased to announce that he will also be reading his poetry in the Lava Center, which is in downtown Greenfield, on Saturday the 20th at 7 p.m. And basically, it's ticket only, but basically this would give you an opportunity to hear him read some of his own works, and I highly recommend it. I listened to him read years ago, and it was quite the treat. He gives a very musical sense to his poetry. And my suspicion is that probably Martina Spada will end up being one of the major players in the canon, those works that are considered to be worthy of study by scholars and critics as time goes on. Of course, we know the canon is oftentimes influenced by the passage of time, so that the more time has gone on, the more gravitas an author might have or a text might have, because they've stood the test of time. And certainly if that author is no longer alive, then we've got a limited production of their works. And I can't know for certain where we would be 50 years from now or 100 years from now, but my guess is that Martina Spada might end up becoming as well known as someone like a Robert Frost, for instance. So this particular poem is quite interesting because it talks about Puerto Rico. And if you aren't necessarily schooled in the unique political place Puerto Rico is in, Puerto Rico is both part of the United States and also not part of the United States. Basically, Puerto Rico is a territory, which means that it follows some of the rules of the United States and has some of the protections of the United States, but it also has a certain sense of sovereignty, and it doesn't necessarily have many of the tax regulations of the United States. It's one of the reasons why big business actually likes this arrangement, because they can operate in Puerto Rico, not have to pay the same level of taxes. Puerto Ricans are Americans, so they can travel freely. However, Puerto Rico itself is considered to be a different culture, and the primary language is Spanish, with English being secondary. And Puerto Rico is an island. In Spanish, it means Puerto Rico, or rich port, and it's quite beautiful. It's located in the Caribbean off of Florida. Unfortunately, because of some of the political situations that it's in, there's a good amount of poverty on the island, and lots of conversations as to whether or not it should maintain its territory status, or whether it should become a state of the United States, or whether it should become an independent nation. And it turns out that Martina Spada is Puerto Rican, and actually so am I. I was born in New York City, and Martina Spada was raised in New York City. And he talks a little bit about that contrast of these two cultures that are clashing. And one of the things that people tend to forget about New York is that it too is an island, a very developed island, but an island nonetheless. So we are comparing and contrasting basically two islands. And I wanted to read the poem to you, and I've provided you with the link, Coca-Cola and Coco Frio. That was written in 1993. And Martina Spada has said that this poem is pretty much autobiographical. He's talking about himself in his youth, on his first visit to Puerto Rico. So Coca-Cola and Coco Frio. And of course, you're quite familiar with Coca-Cola, sugar water, the beverage that perhaps is the most well-known across the planet, illustrating industrialization and the Americanization of the planet. And how that is in contrast to Coco Frio, which happens to be the fresh milk of a coconut. So, on his first visit to Puerto Rico, the island of family folklore, the fat boy wandered from table to table with his mouth open. At every table, some great aunt would steer him with cool, spotted hands to a glass of Coca-Cola. One even sang to him in all the English she could remember. a Coca-Cola jingle from the 40s. He drank obediently, though he was bored with this potion, familiar from soda fountains in Brooklyn. Then, at a roadside stand off the beach, the fat boy opened his mouth to coco frio, a coconut chilled, then scalped by a machete, so that a straw could inhale the clear milk. The boy tilted the green shell overhead and drooled coconut milk down his chin. Suddenly, Puerto Rico was not Coca-Cola or Brooklyn, and neither was he. For years afterwards, the boy marveled at an island where the people drank Coca-Cola and sang jingles from World War II in a language they did not speak, while so many coconuts in the trees sagged heavy with milk, swollen and unsuckled. And yes, indeed, this was Martin Espada's first visit to Puerto Rico, that while he's Puerto Rican, he's visiting Puerto Rico as a tourist because he is being raised in New York City. And he sees Puerto Rico as a tourist, the island of family folklore, that what he knows of it are the stories from his family and the previous generations. And that he is indeed that fat boy. He literally was a fat boy, but also America is quite fat with its abundance and its excess. And certainly if you drink enough Coca-Cola, you'll become fat. The fat boy wandered from table to table with his mouth open, signifying that he's hungry for something. And some great aunt would steer him with cool spotted hands to a glass of Coca-Cola. In other words, this is the older generation, and they're trying to basically assimilate him, as Puerto Rico has been assimilated by America and symbolically by Coca-Cola. One even sang to him in all the English she could remember, a Coca-Cola jingle from the 40s. Again, Spanish being the first language, English being the second. But of course, the Americanization of the island has led to a kind of Spanglish, a mixture of the two. He drank obediently, though he was bored with this potion, familiar from soda fountains in Brooklyn. That this is not what he was looking for when he went to Puerto Rico. He was looking for his culture and his identity, not necessarily to find what he already had in Brooklyn or New York. And now our next stanza, then at a roadside stand off the beach. This is as local as you're going to get. The fat boy opened his mouth to coco frio, a coconut chilled and scalped by a machete, so that a straw could inhale the clear milk. It's the exact opposite of Coca-Cola. It's healthy for you. It's local. It also satisfies his need for culture. The boy tilted the green shell. This is how fresh this coconut is that it's green. Overhead and drooled coconut milk down his chin, illustrating how hungry he is. And of course, milk comes with a lot of associations. Motherhood, for instance, and suckling. And basically, that's what Martin Espada is looking for, or the fat boy, I should say, is looking for, his motherland. And suddenly, Puerto Rico was not Coca-Cola or Brooklyn, and neither was he. This is how he's able to embrace his cultural identity. And for years afterwards, the boy marveled at an island where people drank Coca-Cola and sang jingles from World War II in a language they did not speak. So again, this idea of what has America done to its culture in Puerto Rico. While so many coconuts in the trees sagged heavy with milk, swollen and unsuckled. And again, you're supposed to think of imagery of breasts and motherhood and suckling. That leaves us with one last poem. And this poem happens to be our most recent poem from 2021, The Hill We Climb, which was presented at the presidential inauguration by Amanda Gorman. You'll remember that this was a very stressful time and that it was uncertain for the first time in American history that there would be a peaceful transfer of power, especially after the insurrection of January 6th. So Amanda Gorman very much wanted to deliver a poem of hope. And most people, myself included, first were exposed to this poem by watching it during the inauguration. I remember very clearly my response. Afterwards, I went to social media and I posted, "I've seen the future of poetry," and her name is Amanda Gorman. 21 years old and brilliant. So Sometimes it's best not to just analyze poetry. Maybe it's just best to experience it. Of course, after she delivered her poem, and the delivery is marvelous, after she delivered it, then the poem appeared in print. And you can see that in the notes below. I've included not only the video for when she delivered it in the inauguration, but the print version so that you could appreciate the language by reading it again and again. And that's going to be our attendance question, actually, is that what do you think ultimately about this poem? What is the theme or the purpose of this poem, and why do you believe that? Again, this was a very stressful time. You'll see that she's wearing a bright yellow coat to signify hope and opportunity. Underneath that yellow coat, she's wearing a bulletproof vest, as is everyone on stage, just to give you an idea of how uncertain that time was. So again, our very last attendance question, which would be due on May 13th, Saturday at noon, is what do you think the main message is of The Hill We Climb, and why? And you're not required to respond to your peers, but do read their responses. That's probably a superb way to prepare for the final examination, is to read all of the discussion forum responses and my responses in turn. Which leaves just one last thing. That happens to be section 5, right before our attendance question and notes below. A quick farewell message that's about a minute long or so from a friend of mine. So I encourage you to watch that. And I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will have one more meeting, so to speak, for our final examination. Take care. Bye-bye.